Thank you for listening to this worship podcast of St. Andrew Lutheran Church. I am Peter Johnson, Interim Senior Pastor. We hope this recording provides you with a moment of God's grace wherever this finds you. Know that you're welcome to join us in person for worship in Eden Prairie on Sunday mornings at 9 or 10:30. And also know that any contribution you make will bolster St. Andrew's ministry and outreach, including our podcasting directly to you. You can do so online. Welcome and God's blessings to you.
And now I'm going to solve that mystery of what is this deliverance text. And I will read you this great story from the second chapter of Exodus. Now a man from the house of Levi went and married a Levite woman. The woman conceived and bore a son, and when she saw that he was a fine baby, she hid him 3 months. When she could hide him no longer, she got a papyrus basket for him, plastered it with bitumen and pitch, and she put the child in it and placed it among the reeds on the bank of the river. His sister stood at a distance to see what would happen to him. The daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the river. While her attendants walked beside the river, she saw the basket among the reeds and sent her maid to bring it. When she opened it, she saw the child. He was crying, and she took pity on him. "This must be one of the Hebrews' children," she said. Then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and get you a nurse from the Hebrew women to nurse the child for you?" Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Yeah." So the girl went and called the child's mother. Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this child and nurse it for me, and I will give you your wages." So the woman took the child and nursed it. When the child grew up, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and she took him as her son. She named him Moses because she said, "I drew him out of the water." The word of the Lord.
Good morning. It is so good to be with you this morning as we continue our sermon series on the good book. We've been walking through step by step these stories of our faith. And in the first half of the summer, we've been leaning into the Old Testament. Don't worry, next week we're going to go into those pamphlets at the end of your Bible, as my Old Testament professors always tell me. You know, the Gospels and the Epistles, all of those good stories. We'll be getting into it the rest of the summer. But we're ending on one of, or the most important story of the Old Testament, and that is the Exodus, right? This is the story at the center of this big chunk of our Bible. It's a huge narrative, and you probably know it, right? You know this story of Moses. You know this story of the people of Israel being freed from slavery and being called forth into a promised land. And actually, oddly enough, I was preached to this week just out of a Church Anew article by Walter Brueggemann, who had this to say about the Exodus narrative. "The memory of the Exodus is the seedbed of every revolutionary, emancipatory movement in the history of humanity." Now that's saying something. If you ever get a chance, Walter Brueggemann writes almost weekly for us here at St. Andrew with our ministry, Church Anew. And whenever I think of the story of Exodus, I often think of this as a duel between two powerful men, right? Maybe you think of it this way too. You've got Pharaoh on one side, and you've got Moses on the other. In fact, there's an entire school of history called the Powerful Men School of History that tells the story through these influential humans that had their hands in the midst of history. And maybe you've seen the films, right? If it's Yul Bremner and Charlton Heston in the Ten Commandments, "So let it be written, so let it be done." I know it's not that good, but at least give me the benefit of the doubt. right? Or let my people go. You know, we know this story from the way that it's been told to us, from the way that it's been passed down from generation to generation, from the way that it's been interpreted again and again and again. And we, my friends, are also a part of that again and again and again, listening to the way this story might speak into us today. And when I went to go reread this story, and I encourage you to read it, even the first few chapters, they go by in a snap. It's amazing what you pick up on, what warp and woof of these narratives just dance off of the page as if we were reading a wonderful beach summer novel. Exodus reads like any action-packed narrative that you could pick up at Barnes & Noble. It's a fascinating, important, powerful story. And even if we have Pharaoh on one side and Moses on the other, this is also a story of quiet courage, of simple acts of resistance, of incredibly powerful people who come in surprising packages. And on the first couple of pages, you actually don't see God doing all of the pyrotechnics that you expect God to do in these stories of the Bible. There's no clouds and mystery and God speaking from on high. There's no burning bush. There's no miracles. There's just the story of a people living under the thumb of Pharaoh. Except God does show up in a few surprising sentences. In the first 3 chapters, I brought to you all of the things that God does. God dealt well with the midwives. And if you know that reference, you've been tuning into church all summer long. You get a gold star or 2 or 3. If you don't know the reference, Pastor Peter gave an incredible sermon on Puah and Shiphrah, these midwives who tended the children of Israel. But God also heard their groaning. God remembered the promise, and God took notice of them. So it's this quiet story of courage, this quiet story of a people becoming who they are, but it's also a story where God is whispering in between every single passage. I don't know if your lives ever feel like that. Like all of the action is happening up here, and yet sometimes there's a whisper, or an inkling, or a hum, or a song, or an invitation, or a friend, or a surprise, or a smile, or the pouring down of rain like this morning, where it seems like God is speaking right here. They might be few and far between, but in the first pages of this central-most book of the Old Testament, we hear God whispering more than declaring. We hear God calling or inviting more than acting in big miracles and acts of power. It feels to me a little bit more like how I experience God often. Not in the big to-dos and highs, but sometimes in those quiet moments in between. The other thing that I noticed as I entered this story is how amazing these 2 older sisters are. Never underestimate a big sister. How many big sisters do we have in the room? A fierce group, I'm sure. How many who have big sisters in the room? And you know, don't estimate the power of a big sister. We're introduced to Miriam in the first pages of Exodus, who takes this infant, this baby Moses, and smuggles him out of what would be certain death and into the river, which is where certain death always was. Now, this is not just Purgatory Creek. This is the mighty Nile, the mighty Mississippi, but plus crocodiles, right? I mean, this is not a river that you want to mess with. And of course, Moses' mother wraps this basket and makes this kind of perfectly encapsulated vessel that will float down the river. But it's Miriam who follows it every step along the way, seeing the waves toss it, watching the crocodiles and the hippopotamuses, You choose. But watching the hippos and all of these wild creatures as Moses makes his way to none other than Pharaoh's court. Now, there is something that's more dangerous than a crocodile. There is something more dangerous than a hippo. There's something more dangerous than the violent rushing water of the Nile River. That's Pharaoh. And then we meet our villain. But oddly enough, we don't meet Pharaoh. We meet Pharaoh's daughter, who says to this crying child, "This must be one of the Hebrews tossed into the river." And defying Pharaoh's orders, defying the law, resisting what was put forth as truth, and saying, "I'm going to take this one in." A simple act of incredible courage. And yes, this is Pharaoh's daughter, but perhaps this is the big sister of the next Pharaoh, because the next Pharaoh would be Pharaoh's son. Never underestimate the power of a big sister. And of course, Pharaoh's daughter turns this place of despair, the river Nile, into a route of revolution, a watery womb of freedom. Never underestimate a big sister, but even more, never underestimate our young people. We don't know how old Moses' big sister was. We don't know how old Pharaoh's big sister was, but we know that they were youth. We know that their ideas sparkled with the same possibility as our young people. Never underestimate our youth. We have a few in this room who just were down with 17,000, I'll say it again, 17,000 Lutheran youth in New Orleans, worshiping together, learning together, hearing about God's dreams for them and for the world, wondering about how we are stitched together as a people called forth in God's promises. They heard those promises again and again, and I will never underestimate our youth, because the youth will so often lead the way. But amid those quiet moments where God shows up, the first pyrotechnic episode we see with something that might look a lot like sumac, smiling at us just a few months away. And this is Moses, who's grown up a little bit, who's risked quite a bit, who's gotten into all sorts of trouble back in Egypt and has wandered his way off into the wilderness. And he sees a bush that doesn't burn and hears a voice that says, "Take off your sandals because you're on holy ground." And we hear the voice of God for the first time speaking into this Exodus narrative. And it says exactly this: "Indeed, I know their sufferings, and I have come down to deliver them from the Egyptians and to bring them up out of that land to a good and spacious land, to a land flowing with milk and honey." Now, many of you know that I studied a lot of Bible when I was younger, and I always wondered what a land flowing with milk and honey actually looked like. And the best picture that I had in my brain was actually Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory. I know that that's wrong, but it's what was formed in my early childhood. But what I want you to notice in this is that God is going to deliver the people from the Egyptians out of that land and to a land that is spacious, a land that's flowing with milk and honey. D is indeed for deliverance, and God delivers. It is what God does. It is a part of God's very character. But God always delivers from and to. And it's easy to think about the ways in which we hope that God might deliver us. Deliver us from endless assumptions of more and better. Deliver us from a grind toward perfection or guilt of the past. Deliver us from the weight of decisions for the future. Deliver us from dark nights of the soul. Deliver us from days of despair and seasons of struggle. Deliver us from pains of impossibility. Deliver us from violence in our nation. Deliver us from bloodshed in our world. Deliver us from endless armament or endless consumption. Deliver us, deliver us, deliver us. It would be easy to fit our own stories into this call. Deliver us from. What in your stories needs to be called out of? What in your world or community or eyesight needs God's deliverance today? It's that word that we are invited to this morning. But God doesn't just deliver from, God also delivers to. And in the Exodus story, it's a land of promise. A land that is away from that land marked with the monuments toward Pharaoh's brutality. It's a land marked with milk and honey and the gifts of God's good creation. But perhaps in our days, we are delivered from the impossibility of our moment into the promise that God has in store for us. And a promise might seem flimsy. A promise might seem like something that is out in the future that easily is broken. And if we look to our own human promises, how many of our promises are not fulfilled? But God's promises are sure as the foundations of the earth, as the same love that lit the stars, as the same love that rises from the dead. God delivers us from and into promise. This story of the Exodus reminds me of one of the central themes of our Lutheran faith. And maybe if you were raised in this tradition, you have some semblance of the small catechism. Now, I wasn't raised Lutheran. Many of you know this. I was encouraged, required, to memorize the small catechism when I was an adult. Maybe some of you memorized these words earlier in your childhood. Maybe some of you have never read them before. But there's this line in the small catechism, which is a little book to teach the basics of Christian faith. And it says that I cannot by my own effort or understanding. I cannot by my own effort or understanding. It's this belief that we can't do this on our own. We can't weasel our way out of this moment in our lives, this moment in our world, this moment in time and space and in community. We can't creatively think our way into it. We need deliverance. I cannot by my own effort or understanding. I cannot by my own money or privilege, economic power or military might, political platform or savings account, influence or follower count, good intentions or endless discipline. I cannot by my own. Because God indeed is the one who delivers. God indeed is the one who can call us from and into. This isn't ours to do, my friends. It is God who knit the stars of the heavens, the God who knows our insides and our outs, the God who knows our good intentions and knows how fearfully we often fail. It's this same God that will indeed deliver us. So my invitation for you this week is, if there is a simple prayer, is if there is a simple ask that might encapsulate every concern that we have in this room, everything we might write on endless lists, if we might bring it to God with two simple words: deliver us. So may this be your prayer. It will certainly be mine. Amen.
Thank you for listening to this worship podcast of St. Andrew Lutheran Church. We hope that this recording provides you with a moment of God's grace wherever this finds you. Any contribution you make to St. Andrew will bolster our ministry and outreach, including our podcasting directly to you. You can do so online. Thank you for joining us for this podcast, and I wish you every blessing from Christ today.